Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 2. Thanks so much for all of your focus in your papers, and look for some more feedback coming your way this week as you continue with the next week of exercises. If at any point you have challenges with the technology, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email, and even if we need, we can set up a time for us to chat one-on-one by phone. Happy to help in any way we can that way. So as you'll see, Chapter 2 is really about the trait approach of leadership. And it stems back from the early 1900s around what's called a great person theory. So we'll talk about that and how that shift in that focus has really changed over time and why that change has happened. And then really gets into this differentiating between leaders and non-leaders. So let's jump right in. The great person theory, as you can see, was stemmed in the early 1900s as the great man theory. Obviously, there was not a lot of focus on gender equality at that point in time, and so thus the name. And one of the things that it did was really just looked at the innate qualities, and you can see this probably helped give birth to the concept of leadership. Are you born with it or can it be developed? Really the premise of it was just studying great leaders and what it was they did that was in common. If you think of the recent bestseller Good to Great, it did the same thing around organizations and what they did to outperform organizations that had fallen out of the Fortune 100. So when you look at American history and really how the economic growth, military interactions, and really just society in general and how it's created a shift in the trait perspective, it's a pretty interesting slide to look at this way. You start out with, the beginning of the century. You're coming out of this industrial revolution where great men, again with the gender inequalities, were starting up, inventing massive businesses and rolling out and really just started to be labeled as great leaders. In the same way, military was very focused in the early 1900s on just kind of this command and control, just follow what that one person was saying. And so leadership had a very finite list, individual characteristics that you were either a leader or not a leader. As you moved into the 30s to the 50s, you're now coming into a time frame where you have the Second World War, you have the Depression, you have Rosie the Riveter, where you had a large female workforce kind of counter addressing the economic needs, while a large contingency of military personnel were overseas. And you can see that the traits started interacting with situations, and really I think a lot of that was influenced by the war, because you had these attacks and counterattacks, and there became this less linear approach to leadership. You couldn't just do step 1 through 10 without shifting a game plan. And so you can see how that situational approach really started to influence how trait perspective could be viewed. And at the same time, the first half of the century, let's be honest, the respect for the employee was probably not there the way it should have been, and thus wages, work conditions, the presence of unions, etc., all influenced how capitalism kind of took shape, and therefore how leadership took shape. When you look at the second half of the century, you start out with the 70s through the 90s and this focus on personality and behaviors. Think about it, right? You're coming out of Vietnam, you're going into this very anti-institutional phase where people were rebelling against the church, against government, against large organizations in general. And they had much more sensitivity around values and as you see, the personality and behavior, or as Kirkpatrick and Locke put, the right stuff for a leader. And everybody kind of started to build their own definition of the right stuff. So it was less, like the early 1900s, where there were leaders and non-leaders, and more about, different lists of the right stuff. They've done a lot of research in this area, and you saw the economic booms of the .com start to be influenced by this, the yuppie era, but you also had within the yuppie area a bit of the capitalism come through and how employees were dealt with. You had a significant amount of layoffs in the 80s due to an economic downturn, and that was really a major shift from a leadership perspective and from an employee relations perspective, where it was probably the last straw, where the employees now pretty much, the majority of cases started to distance themselves from loyalty to the company and got into loyalty to the leader. And then, you can see how that influences all the way to the right, the 5 major leadership traits: intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. Again, some of these items could be knocked around a bit. I've done leadership exercises before where I'll survey a group of 20 people that are in a leadership class and ask them to come up with their top 10 characteristics. And I'll be honest, 9 out of 10 times intelligence doesn't come up on the list. Confidence does. Determination comes out either as a determination type word or more so competitive. But the one piece that the integrity is huge, obviously, in a post 9/11 Enron world. The sociability gets into, I had the opportunity to hear President Reagan's last chief of staff speak just a couple of weeks ago. And his focus was that people love to love the president. And so when they don't love the president, it's a snowball effect on their approval ratings. But for me, this isn't the exhaustive list. And as we said through this course, it's not about you memorizing anything. It's about you making decisions on what traits you find fit you best, what traits fit your organization best. I work in a very, very relationship-based organization, so I see inclusion as a major leadership trait. If you don't choose to include others and others don't want to be included in what you're doing, you won't get much done in our organization. So it's something to think about. I see that very different than sociability, which is really just being liked. So let's keep this one in mind as you kind of think through the evolution. And there's also something to be said about when was your company that you work for started, and is it influenced by kind of old school leadership, or is it more modern because it's a younger organization? So the next 2 slides get into the list of the 5 major leadership traits. It's pretty self-explanatory here. So we're not going to get into much detail here, but just wanted to keep them in so you had the full focus here. I think integrity is oftentimes disguised as more about the financials, and really it's more about walking the talk and words and actions syncing so that a leader can be trusted. The summer Harvard Business Review article from last year, the whole story was about trust and about post-recession, in this time where people are responding to layoffs and cutbacks, and people were constantly looking over their shoulders. It's influencing how people trust leaders, not only from a job security perspective, but even from a project security. Is the funding of my project going to be pulled because someone else has another leader's ear and they're getting funding? You're combating each other for the funding. So the integrity takes different shapes. Integrity is also just about how authentic you are in your conversations. So if you're giving someone, another person feedback, are you trying to set them up for success, or are you trying to knock them down, is a big part of integrity as well. When you look at the 5-factor personality model here, the big 5 that they call it, again, not going to go into massive detail here, but a couple of quick points. The one that always sticks out for most when they look at this list is the first, of neuroticism. And I think a lot of this is influenced by really the mantra that Jack Welch from GE used to share, which is that great leaders wake up every day paranoid. And you think about the reinvention theme that we had from last week, and you think about how it's this kind of perpetual reinvention. It really stems from this feeling vulnerable and insecure, not to the point that it takes away from your overall leadership competence, but more so about insecure and vulnerable from a business perspective. So it's not the person, it's the task. And so you're kind of pushing that envelope of how do you make things faster, better, or cheaper, and you're knowing that what made you successful this year as a business may not make you successful next year. whether it be market saturation or product extinction or whatever the focus might be. The extroversion makes sense, though. I mean, people want to be around people that are contagious and really they like to be around. But you'll see that some of the research around the openness and the agreeableness. Now, emotional intelligence is definitely one of my more favorite topics in this book, in the whole course itself. For those of you that are new to this concept, it's basically if IQ is your kind of book smarts, then EQ gets into your street smarts. And the focus is really understanding how you can influence progress based on how you manage your emotions. And so examples of this might look like, think about conversations that you've been in at work where things get a little volatile, and how do you respond? How calm can you stay? Can you stay true to what it is you're trying to accomplish? Can you differentiate between the task and the person? Can you really drive through on what it is you're trying to focus on and not let your emotions get the best of you? It could be keeping a poker face. It could be biting your tongues and not responding to what you really want to say. It could be saying what you really do want to say for the good of the group. So you can see the underlying premise is really about, if you're more sensitive with your emotions, then you'll have more impact. And I've definitely found that true in my career. I don't think you have to be the sharpest pencil in the box and the smartest person in the room to be a successful leader. I think there's something to be true about, something to be said about the truth of bringing the right people in the room and facilitating that dialogue, and making sure that the group can stay connected around the task at hand and not get caught up in turf wars or personal battles or things along that line. So if you're interested in this, I would recommend, there's a great book out there called Working with Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. He's one of the thought leaders in this area that made it more mainstream of a concept. There's plenty before him that did the original research, but he's definitely one of the more popular authors and has a good read in working with emotional intelligence. So when you look at the trait approach, let's just focus on the model itself, and you'll see as we move through the following weeks, we'll have not only a presentation of the chapter, but on the back end, the strengths and the criticisms of the model that we're talking about. The beauty of the trait approach is that it's really getting into a combination of what traits leaders exhibit, and so it's very tangible. It's very much a list, and there's personality assessments like Myers-Briggs. Some of you may have heard of as MBTI, which can really be used, whether it's from a development perspective to show where you have to grow, or some even are used as hiring tools to see whether you fit within that organization. But you can see, and you get into this with the weaknesses and the shortcomings, the right people. Right's a very, very subjective term, and it varies not only from person to person, but organization to organization, and what kind of person will work best in that space. So the strengths are that it is appealing. People love lists. People love lists they can grab onto, and they want to view these leaders as gifted and special. There's 100 years of research to back it up, and so because of that, there's benchmarks, and you can say, on a scale of 1 to 10, most leaders are a 6 in this area, and I'm a 5, so I need to grow a little bit more, or I'm a 7 and I'm excelling in this area. And people like that. They like to be able to measure, and let's face it, people like to keep score. The criticism is what I talked before. It's subjective. Everybody has their own list, and it doesn't. If you create a finite list, it may not be as valuable on sunny days as it is on rainy days. So when things are straightforward and linear, great, use those 5. But what about when you're in a state of crisis or revolution or economic turmoil? Then do those 5 really hold true? Something to definitely think about. So as you go into the application and you think about doing your survey this week, focus on all the data that's been presenting here. Focus on the 5 leadership traits to the right here, and use that data collection to, as I mentioned before, differentiate what you think would be on the list and what you think wouldn't. It'll be interesting as you kind of think about who you should survey. include people that you really admire as leaders and maybe some that you're like not so sure about. Then that way you can really get an aggregate approach, and don't just pick people that you survey that are only like you and how they view leadership. So hope you found this valuable, and look forward to reading more about your reactions.